Hello, I'm Edward October. Over the years, I've narrated more ghost stories, horror shows, and creepypastas than I can count. And yet, the crimes discussed on our true crime podcast managed to scare the shit out of me. This program is not suitable for children or the faint of heart. If you are such a person, go ahead and switch off this podcast. Listen to something else. Are you still with us? Well, we've warned you.
Hey, Jen.
Hey, Cam, how you doing?
I'm darn well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great.
Here, you got a case for us.
I do have a case for you today. Of course I have a case. It's my turn. Duh.
Well, I just like to pretend that I don't know what's going on.
I know.
Just kidding. I don't know what's going on.
Are you ready?
I'm so ready. Let's go.
All righty. We're going to go back in time. The community of McAllen, Texas, was in a flurry of activity on Holy Saturday in 1960. Across the county, food for the next day's Easter feast was being prepared, and people were excited since Lent's dietary restrictions were finally over, and many children looked forward to the visit from the Easter Bunny. Pastel cotton dresses had been ironed to crisp perfection, and the little boys would complain that their ties and starched shirts were too itchy.
I remember that. That's so cute.
And your little white Mary Janes.
Well, mine were black, but yeah.
All considered 25-year-old Irene Garza to be a devout Catholic. She attended daily mass at Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, and there's nothing pretentious or fake about Irene. She lived her faith, and being good to others was part of her life's mantra. She told a friend of hers that she had found strength and comfort from her daily communion, so it was only natural that she would go to confession that Saturday evening. In fact, her family said that Irene attended confession every Saturday, whether she needed it or not. The evil she would encounter there in her place of comfort, her sanctuary, would leave an entire community reeling in grief and questioning their faith. Located in the Rio Grande Valley, McAllen, Texas sits across the border from Mexico. While it might be a winter resort now, at one time McAllen was just a small town with the proverbial railroad tracks separating the Anglos from the Hispanics. Even the hospitals had separate wards for the Mexican Americans in southern Texas in the 1960s, and those dividing lines blurred somewhat as the town grew. But when Irene Garza was born in 1934, Mexican Americans still faced serious discrimination. Irene could maneuver around many of the dividing lines due partly to her incredible beauty and also to her father's financial success. Born on the south side of the tracks, Irene's family was able to move to a more affluent north side, the Anglo side, when she was just a child. For Irene's parents, Nicholas and Josephina, this meant that they could give their children, Irene and her little sister Josie, a better life than what they had had. Irene and Josie flourished, enjoying their part of the American dream. Irene graduated from McAllen High School, where she was the first to perform as head drum majorette. She was crowned the 1958 Miss South Texas Sweetheart, and she was crowned both prom and homecoming queen at Pan American College, where she graduated with a degree in teaching. And she was the first person in her family to attend college. Irene became a second-grade teacher, and while she could have gotten a job on the north side of the town, Irene wanted to teach children in the lower-income community, so she chose to teach on the south side of the tracks. She often used her own paycheck to buy school supplies for the children who couldn't afford them. And just to show you, times have not changed.
Thank you.
Irene was quiet and shy, but instead of letting those traits hold her back, she forced herself out of her comfort zone. She became the secretary of her parent-teacher association. Most who knew her described her beauty as going way beyond skin deep, and she was a gentle, beautiful soul. Even though getting married and having children were high on her priority list, she didn't rush it. She dated a few men, but none of them had been right for her. She didn't want to settle just to get the ring, the big house, and the 2.4 children. She only wanted to marry if the man was kind and devout and right for her. So at 25, Irene still lived with her parents. And just a reminder, the median age in 1960 to get married for a woman was 20 years old.
I was going to say she would be considered
young. Yeah.
Yeah, old.
Mm-hmm. They got married young. On Saturday, April 16th, 1960, Irene phoned a friend to see if she would like to go to confession with her. Her friend wasn't home, so Irene went by herself. Because she was such a striking-looking woman, many people remember seeing her in one of the confession lines that evening. Irene arrived at 7 p.m., placed a white veil over her head, and knelt down to pray. And at that point in time, women were still expected to cover their heads during church services, especially in the more conservative parishes. Irene entered one of the confessionals and seemingly disappeared. And while nobody in church saw her leave, she was seen entering the rectory by at least one witness. And the rectory is the private home of the priests, which is usually located right next to the church, or at least somewhere on the same grounds as the church. When 9 p.m. rolled around, Irene's parents thought maybe she had decided to stay for Easter Vigil Mass, so they weren't too worried. Their daughter was safely at church, not out bar hopping, so what could possibly go wrong at church?
Yeah, you would never think anything.
But when Irene hadn't arrived home by midnight, the Garzas became very concerned. The church was only a 5-minute drive from their home. Afraid their daughter might have been in a car accident, they drove through town, up and down the streets, keeping a lookout for Irene. When they reached Sacred Heart Church at about 2:30 in the morning, her parents found a dark, empty building and parking lot. They found Irene's car 2 blocks from the church a short while later, and then they immediately reported her missing. Family, friends, and neighbors joined city, state, and county police in the search for Irene Garza. This included horseback searches from the sheriff's office, aerial searches by border control, and divers who rooted around the irrigation canals. Even the National Guard was called in. It was the most extensive search in the Rio Grande Valley's history at the time. One thing that became clear to investigators was that nobody saw Irene leave the church or the church grounds, and she was last seen at 8:15 p.m. Several priests stated that they were in the rectory at the time Irene would have been on the grounds, but none of them reported seeing Irene or anything suspicious. By the next day, all the family, friends, volunteer, and professional searches had not turned up a single clue as to Irene's whereabouts. The search perimeters were then enlarged, and the volunteers, police, and deputies began searching back roads and farmers' fields. It didn't take long for Irene's purse to be found on the side of the road. Covered in mud, the purse still held her identification inside. Then, her left shoe and lace veil were also found discarded on the side of the road. At that moment, her family held a collective breath, hoping for a miracle but expecting the worst. After all, there could be many reasons why Irene's purse could be discarded. It could have been stolen, she could have dropped it, all sorts of stuff. And just because a person lost her purse didn't mean they were dead. But a missing shoe and a veil meant that Irene was somewhere without those items. It meant Irene wasn't wearing her shoes, and there was no benign reason for Irene to be without her shoes. What's more, to authorities, it looked as if somebody had just checked those items out from a car window, deliberately trying to get rid of evidence. In the days immediately after Irene's disappearance, the investigation was plagued with several hoaxes. One was a man who threatened a bartender, telling her that he'd killed Irene and that she was next. That would be so scary. The bartender reported the incident to the authorities, and then the man, who had sobered up by that point, explained to police that he'd been drunk and just thought it was funny.
That's what I was thinking. That's why I didn't say anything, because I was like, well, it depends on if somebody's drunk
just
and says
funny.
that, or
I just thought
not
it's
funny, buddy.
Right. Another incident proven to be a hoax was a woman who called the police to claim that she was Irene and that she was being held captive in a motel room. To say the second hoax was cruel would be an understatement. It gave her family false hope, and it also wasted police time and resources.
What is wrong with people? Why would you do that?
Attention? I don't know. 5 days after she went missing on April 21st, 1960, the body of Irene Garza was found floating in the 2nd Street irrigation canal, just 3 miles from the Sacred Heart Church where Irene was last seen. Mm-hmm. She was left partially dressed, her underwear and shoes were missing, and her blouse was unbuttoned. Irene's large extended family was at the Garza home when her parents received the horrifying news. Irene's mother let out an anguished wail, quote, like the howl of a wolf, and collapsed into a puddle. The autopsy report showed that Irene suffered blunt force trauma to the right side of her head, a brain hemorrhage, and suffocation. She had also been beaten, as the autopsy showed bruising to both of her eyes. Her death certificate stated that Irene was raped, but specified that it was while she was in a coma. Which, I don't understand how they can find that out.
I don't either.
But that's all different articles stated.
I guess
so we're going to go with it.
Well, I guess they could see that it still has brain activity, so therefore...
Yeah, but how do you tell that she was raped while she was in a coma? I don't understand. That's all I'm saying. Tried to Google it. I couldn't find any explanation. So if you do know, email me.
Well, if she was physically injured, maybe.
Yeah, but she was beaten. She was beaten also, into a coma.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that works. Anyway, the loss of Irene was devastating for her family and friends. Irene was a role model for all the little girls in her family and community. She volunteered so much of her time to help others. She was loved and respected by everyone who knew her. About 4 blocks south of where Irene's body was found, a shoe print was discovered. Embedded in the print was a clump of thick, dark hair believed to have been Irene's. They also found tire tracks and an imprint of Irene's petticoat in the mud. Police interviewed over 500 people in the weeks after her body was found, including sex offenders in the region. The investigators also included anyone who was in the church on Holy Saturday. To the best of their abilities, the investigators recreated where each parishioner stood when Irene was in church. The church had been open most of the afternoon specifically for confession, and there were 4 priests hearing those confessions. One of Irene's students found a purse sitting in one of the pews, and, after services, seeing that nobody had collected the purse, took it to the rectory and gave it to one of the priests, Father John Fite. 27-year-old John Fite had been in the McAllen church for only a few weeks since completing seminary training in San Antonio, Texas. Fite, an intelligent man often described as aloof, was born in Chicago in 1932. His family were devout Catholics and had relatives who were also priests. When he was 13, his parents sent him to a seminary in San Antonio, Texas, and he was ordained in 1958 and only recently arrived in McAllen. More than one priest was hearing confessions on Holy Saturday, but Irene had been in line for Father Fite. Upon further questioning of witnesses, most of them remember seeing several priests returning from the rectory on Holy Saturday, but no one remembered seeing Irene leave the rectory. Furthermore, there was no reason for a congregation member to be inside the priest's private residence. Witnesses also reported that the line for Father Fite's confession had moved exceptionally slow that night, and that at one point there was a sign that there was no priests in the booth at all. They also saw Fite leave the sanctuary several times, which is unusual. And some witnesses state that the line to his confession stopped at around 8 p.m. and didn't pick back up until much later. Father Fite helped with the Easter Vigil Mass, which began at midnight. He said he then performed 2 morning masses on Easter Day, a late afternoon mass, and baptisms in between. 2 weeks after Irene's body was discovered, the authorities drained the canal in hopes of finding more evidence. They found a set of candlesticks from the Sacred Heart Church in one of the canals, which might have been used as the weapon to murder Irene. They also found a light green Eastman Kodaslide viewer, which had a long cord attached to it. Police published a picture of the slide viewer in the newspaper, asking for the public's help to identify the owner. Father Fite openly admitted that it belonged to him. However, he gave no reason as to why these items had been discarded in the canal. Many question why Father Fite would openly admit to the slide viewer being his. One investigator said that he thought it was because the priest was taunting the police. Some believe that Father Fite was worried that somebody else would identify him as the owner of the slide viewer, and it would look less suspicious if he came forward first. Fellow priests at the rectory said that they noticed scratch marks on Fite's hands after the Easter Vigil Mass. Irene's friend Anna told the police that one other time Father Fite had heard Irene's confession in the rectory, the private residence of the priest, mind you, rather than in the church. He had told Irene that she was, quote, too good to give confession in the confessionals.
What?
Yep, this is highly unusual and very suspicious.
Very.
Irene had told Anna that she found it strange and confusing that Father John insisted that she go to the rectory, but ultimately she didn't question him. Because why?
Authority figure.
He's a priest, after all. He's
Yep.
a holy, authoritative figure in Irene's eyes. When questioned, Father Fite initially denied having heard Irene's confession, but later admitted to it. When investigators asked him why he had left the church so many times during confession, he stated that he had just taken a few breaks. He said that around 9:50 p.m., he'd broken his glasses and driven back to his church pastoral's house in San Juan to get his spare eyeglasses, all while confession and mass were taking place. When he arrived at the house, he didn't have a key, so he climbed up to the second floor and entered through an unlocked window. As if his excuse wasn't suspicious enough, he also claimed that he sustained the scratches on the backs of his hand while scaling up the side of the building. However, in an earlier statement, he didn't mention his broken glasses, but instead said that he had been sweating so much that he needed to get a dry shirt. So he drove all the way back to San Juan to get a new one. But honestly, he more than likely had clean shirts right there in McAllen, so maybe that's why he changed his story. Mm-hmm. Privately, investigators believe that John Fite was the man responsible for Irene Garza's death, and rumors had begun to spread widely across the Rio Grande Valley that a priest had murdered Irene Garza. And even though the shoe print found at the scene where Irene's body was dumped didn't match John Fite's, the police felt that there could be an explanation for that. I mean, John could have gotten rid of the shoes and been wearing that night, and it's possible somebody else had come along and unknowingly contaminated the crime scene. For them, the shoe print wasn't enough to rule him out as a suspect. The main reason to include him as a suspect, aside from the slide viewer, candelabra, scratches on his hands, changing testimony, and eyewitnesses seeing Irene go to the rectory that night, was a woman named Maria America Guerra. 3 weeks before Irene Garza's death, 12 miles away in Edinburgh, Texas, Maria America Guerra, a parishioner of another church called the Sacred Heart Church, was assaulted by a priest. 20-year-old Guerra had returned to Edinburgh from Pan America College to visit her family. On March 23, 1960, Guerra had freshened up outside in the bathhouse of her family's home and noticed a man watching her. He had black hair, wore horn-rimmed glasses, and sat in a blue and white car parked outside the church right across the street from the Guerra home. After dinner, she walked across the street to the church to pray. Entering the sanctuary, she noticed the same man sitting in a back pew. Guerra passed him, knelt at the communion rail, and began to pray her rosary. The man from the back of the church approached her from behind and grabbed her around the head. She fell backwards, and he tried to shove a piece of cloth into her mouth. Guerra screamed, kicked, and bit down on his finger so hard that she broke the skin and tasted blood. The man slammed her to the ground and ran out of the church. A witness heard Guerra scream and saw the man hastily exiting the building. Guerra then ran past the witness as fast as she could across the street to the safety of her own home. Later, Guerra reported the incident to the police, and church officials suspected that Father John was responsible for the attack. Not only did he fit the description, but he drove a blue and white car. But instead of reporting him or defrocking him, they sent him to McAllen, Texas, to be observed. We know the story now, don't we? In May of 1960, just a few weeks after Irene's murder, the police asked Guerra and the woman who was in the church the night that she was attacked to view a lineup. Both Guerra and the witness independently picked Father John Fite out of the lineup as the man who had attacked Guerra in the church that night. Local church leaders discouraged people from considering the possibility that a priest could be responsible. Fite admitted that he was in the church that day but denied assaulting her. Police noticed during questioning that his finger was injured, and it looked to be a bite mark. Tilly, the secretary at the church, said that she could see teeth marks on his finger. She also said that Fite had a very distinct voice, and after the murder of Irene Garza, the man called her and said, quote, "You're next, Tilly," and she felt for sure it was Father Fite. For investigators in the Irene Garza case, all roads led back to John Fite. The fact that Guerra and Garza were both young, attractive Hispanic women in the same proximity as Fite made investigators uneasy and called him in for a polygraph. Initially, they stated that Father Fite had passed his polygraph test, but later said it had been inconclusive. The man who administered the polygraph would later state that he'd felt from the beginning that Fite failed the polygraph. And, as we all know, Polygraphs are no longer allowed as evidence of guilt or innocence in a court of law. Guess that really doesn't matter now, does it?
Well,
but the
no.
fact that the guy who took it said that he lied,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In August of 1960, Father Fite was charged with assault and with an attempt to rape in the case of Marie America Guerra. But when police went to arrest him, they discovered that Fite was in the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri.
Oh.
Fite claimed he was there to calm his nerves from all the stress.
And or hiding. Your choice.
Right. And for those of you that don't know, the Alexian Brothers Hospital here in St. Louis is where the famous exorcism took place in 1949, which inspired the novel The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, which inspired the movie, which scared the hell out of me as a kid.
Which they have a new one out too, by the way.
Yes. CBS News reported that, quote, when bishops had bad actors among the priests, including sexual abuse, they would send priests to a specialized healthcare facilities, said Thomas Doyle, a priest who specializes in abuse cases among the clergy. In the case of John Fite, it was Alexian Brothers. They took in priests and promised anonymity. Just a month later, the church requested to send Fite back to the Alexian Brothers once again. Quote, in a September 15th, 1960 letter, the Very Reverend John A. Hakey wrote, we are sincerely grateful for your past gracious handlings of our good Father Fite, and we assure you that taking him in on the same conditions as previously will in no way jeopardize the good name of your institution or bring it any detrimental publicity.
Mm-hmm.
In the same article, they also claimed that when the church found itself with a troubled priest, they would simply move him. Known as the geographic solution, they would move the problem priest from one parish to another. They also tried counseling, but rarely, it would seem, no matter how bad the infraction, they were never turned over to the police.
And we all know that just doesn't simply go away on its own.
It doesn't. Even with counseling, sometimes it doesn't go away. Hey guys, it's been 3 weeks since I've been using the Spa Styler Blow Dry and Scalp Massager Hair Dryer by Yaman USA, and let me tell you, I think it's the best hair tool I've used in a long time. I mean, it's definitely worth splurging on. I'm amazed that it uses less heat, but somehow dries my hair twice as fast. And it's also super lightweight and a heck of a lot quieter than my other hair dryer. It also has red light therapy technology, and I think it's the only one on the market. The red light helps promote hair growth, and while I haven't been using it long enough to see any growth, my hair does look a lot shinier, smoother, and healthier. Hardly any frizz at all. Oh, and the scalp massager attachment is so very relaxing, so very soothing. I mean, it helps lift my hair up at the roots, which gives me volume. And also, if you're lucky enough to have curly hair, you can also use the attachment as a diffuser. I really do like the Spa Styler Blow Dry and Scalp Massage Hair Dryer, and I don't think I'll ever use any other brand again. If you want to experience the future of beauty, you can visit yamanusa.com and use code TCP for a 20% discount. That's code TCP at yamanusa.com to get your 20% discount. A year later, when Fite's case for attacking Guerra went to court, the court ended in a hung jury. In 1962, quote, rather than face a second trial, Fite entered a plea of no contest to a misdemeanor charge of aggravated assault and paid a $500 fee, which in today's money, it's $5,200. Off the record, the deal was that if he pled no contest, he would not be charged with the murder of Irene Garza. However, Fite later said that he didn't understand that a no contest plea was the same as admitting guilt.
He's an educated man. He had to know that.
Yeah. In early February 1962, 5 months after the Maria American Guerra trial and less than 2 years after Irene Garza's murder, Fite was sent to Dubuque, Iowa, and the new Melleray Abbey, a monastery for Trappist monks. The life of a Trappist monk is one of simplicity, devotion, and discipline, and it was the perfect place for a problem priest to hide. By 1963, the church moved Father Feit again, this time to another Trappist monastery, Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. There, Feit would meet Dale Trachny. Trachny was a young monk serving as novice master at the monastery, training new prospective monks. In 1963, the abbot called Trachny to an unusual assignment. He told Trachny that, quote, "There's a priest who murdered a woman who was in the guest house. He wants to become a monk, and we are instructed to take him in." Trachny was not given any further details. Trachny said he counseled Feit for more than 6 months, and during that time he stated that Feit admitted to attacking a young woman following her confession, then keeping her captive overnight and leaving her to suffocate. Father John Feit then told him that the woman was eventually dumped in a canal. Trachny stated that he never pushed to get the young woman's name. In a CBS interview, Trachny stated, quote, "While I knew that Father Feit had committed the murder, I felt that my primary function with Father Feit was to see if, perhaps, he ultimately might not have a vocation to become a monk in the monastery." Really? I would think monks wouldn't commit murder.
But you would think.
What?
And then they get to go. Then they get to go hide.
Yeah,
doesn't work like that in the real world.
Trachny also said that Feit admitted to him his desire to attack women from behind, but was triggered by the sound of their high heels clicking on the floor. Later, Trachny would tell police the details of Feit's confession. Feit told Trachny that he'd heard Irene's confession in the rectory and then, quote, "subdued her and took part of her clothes off from the waist up and then fondled her breasts."
Ugh.
He put her in the rectory basement and returned to the church to hear confessions. He went back to the rectory and moved her to an apartment he maintained. The next day, which was Easter, he put her in a bag in the bathtub. As he left, he heard her saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." When he returned later on Easter, she was dead. He put her body in the car, patted on her breast, telling her everything will be okay. Feit never named the victim in his confession to Trachny, nor the location or date he committed the crime, but because Feit had come to the Abbey from San Antonio in 1963, Trachny assumed that that was the date and the locale of the crime. When Trachny asked Feit why he was not in prison if he killed a woman, Feit responded, quote, "Because the church is behind me." This was evident in a letter from Father Paulicki at the St. Helens Mission to Father Seidel, who was the head of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate Order, to which Feit belonged. These are excerpts from the letter, but it can be found entirely online. The prosecution must be made to see how weak their case is, lest they go off half-cocked and set the wheels into motion that would bring this out in public print and give the opponents of the church a field day. There are also political implications to this that could make this a juicy scandal for the opposition to Kennedy, meaning John F. Kennedy. He was running for president. We should not put a detective on the case hired by us, since that would mean he would be snooping around, re-questioning witnesses, and stirring up things again. They can also be brought to realize nicely that the church will not take this sitting down. After 3 or 4 months, or even less as possible, have this young man transferred to another part of the country as normal obedience. He feels that everyone knows that priests are always being transferred around, so this would not be strange. After some time in his new place, a year or 2, then have him sent out to a foreign mission. The reason for the first move is to get him out of the area of suspicion. If something happens, the officers of the area will always be suspicious of him. And if that weren't bad enough, the letter goes on to show collusion with the sheriff at the time of the murder. Quote, "The sheriff concludes that the longer time we have, the weaker the case gets, and so he suggested all this foregoing. He also is a Catholic, and he also stands to lose materially by such scandal there, in such a non-Catholic area. I feel that he has rendered us an invaluable service." And it's also to be known that I believe the sheriff was up for re-election that year, too. And he was Catholic. By late 1963, Trachny and his superior felt it was safe for Father Feit to return to society. Once again, he was moved, and this time Loyola University, where he only attended for 1 semester. President John F. Kennedy, the only Catholic president of the United States at the time, had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and it disturbed Father Fite so much that he couldn't continue his studies. He was then moved to Jemez Springs, New Mexico, a facility run by a Roman Catholic religious order called the Servants of the Paraclete. This facility was considered the end of the road for many priests. It was where the worst offenders were sent in a last-ditch effort to rehabilitate them. According to the founder of the facility, quote, "Our cure is simple. It's based on the sovereignty of love."
Mm-hmm. Mm-mm.
By 1968, Father John Fite, a man guilty of assault on one woman and strongly suspected of rape and murder of another, had risen to the position of superior at the facility, supervising about 80 priests at the time, one of which was Father James Porter. Porter would eventually plead guilty to molesting 28 children, once telling a reporter that he had abused upwards of 100 children.
Unbelievable.
The case of James Porter caused a national outcry, and the U.S. Conference of Bishops adopted new guidelines for handling priests charged with child molestation. His case was one that shone a national spotlight on the issue of the church hierarchy, being not only complicit, but also the architects of a cover-up in cases of abuse committed by priests. And Father John Fite was tasked with counseling and rehabilitating them. Fite would often release Porter temporarily to help short-staffed parishes in the area, and each time he did that, James Porter would claim more victims. Father John Fite left the priesthood in 1971 of his own volition, and in 1972 he married a Hispanic woman who he met in New Mexico, and the couple went on to have 3 children. For the next 44 years, John Fite raised his family and enjoyed the life that Irene Garza was denied. He worked for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul as a food charity volunteer for 17 years, and there are many accounts praising John Fite's generosity towards people experiencing poverty. But in 2002, that would all change. Dale Chachney had left the Trappist monks in 1967, and then, when 2002 rolled around and the Globe published their articles about the church being complicit in protecting abusive priests, Chachney thought back to his days with Father Fite. His knowledge that a priest had committed murder who had gone unpunished for over 40 years ate at him, and he realized that he had been part of the problem. He simply couldn't die without setting the record straight, if for no other reason than to give Irene Garza's family answers.
Good.
Chachney called the San Antonio Police Department and told Detective George Sadler about Fite and Fite's confession to him. Sadler asked for details of the case, and Dale said that the murder happened in 1963, not in 1960. But as it happened, Rudy Jaramillo had recently dusted off Garza's case in the cold case unit. So Sadler knew exactly which case Chachney was describing. Jaramillo decided to call up Father Joseph O'Brien, a priest who had worked with Fite at the time Garza was murdered. And Father O'Brien had publicly denied any knowledge of who killed Irene for years.
Mm-hmm.
But when Detective Jaramillo called him, Father O'Brien also decided to clear his conscience. And he said that Fite had confessed to him shortly after the murder that he was the one responsible. Armed with this new information, investigators went to the district attorney of Hidalgo County, Texas, Irene Garza, who's unrelated to Maria America Guerra. They went to him to see if they could get the case brought before a grand jury. But Irene Garza decided that Garza's murders case was unsolvable and that he had no interest of going any further with it. He said, quote, "Her killer got away. Where are you going to find the evidence? I reviewed the file some years back and there was nothing there. Can it be solved? Well, I guess if you believe pigs can fly, anything's possible. Why would anyone be haunted by her death? She died. Her killer got away."
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. And with that callous statement, the chance of getting any justice for Irene was shut down. However,
not even human.
I know. However, in 2003, due to pressure from the family and media, Garza finally sent the case to the grand jury. The case lasted 15 weeks, and Garza didn't call the police in to give testimony until the 11th week. Nobody from the church who witnessed Fate's bizarre behavior on Holy Saturday in 1960 was called in either. The DA wanted nothing less than fingerprints or DNA evidence. He felt that both Father O'Brien and Dale Chachney were unreliable witnesses, even though there was no evidence to suggest this.
Why would he think that? Like, what gave him that impression?
I have no idea. No idea. So the grand jury decided not to indict John Fite. But the media wouldn't let up. They kept requesting the file on the case. The district attorney threatened to prosecute McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez if he'd revealed the material because Garza said, quote, "There are some things that have to be kept secret that just cannot be put into print." And he also told Irene's cousin that Fite would never be indicted and repeated, "When pigs fly."
Did he know them? Was he Catholic?
I have no idea. I couldn't find anything about, I'm sure he was Catholic. But
I just don't know what the hang-up is.
I don't either. But anyway, and that's how things were until 2014 when the new DA, Ricardo Rodriguez, was elected. And part of his campaign focused on getting justice for Irene. And he followed through with his promise. He indicted John Fite in 2015 for the murder of Irene Garza. His prosecutor, Mike Garza, unrelated to Irene, took the case to court. And when John Fite, who was then an old man living out his twilight years in a retirement community in Arizona, was arrested, he said, quote, "Why now? I just want to know, after all these years, why now?"
Because, buddy, and it should have happened a long time ago.
It should have.
So there's that.
57 years after Irene's torturous murder, Father John Fite was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Many of Irene's cousins and friends were still alive and celebrated the day that pigs flew. But some of Irene's family thought that John Fite should have been forgiven, stating that if he had asked forgiveness from God, he would be in heaven right along with Irene and that earthly punishment wasn't necessary.
I wonder if that happened to their families or their daughter or their mother, if they would feel the same.
That is Irene's family. Some of their family felt that that's the way it should have been.
Then they are devoutly religious and nicer people than me.
Much nicer than I am. That attitude toward the person who killed their daughter is unusual, like we talked about. Maybe because he was a priest. Many also felt that because he was an old man and apparently hadn't committed any other assaults the rest of his life, that he should be given a lenient sentence.
We know about. He kept that one pretty well guarded this whole time.
But Mike Garza and many other people feel that John Fite was a predator, a man who allowed a woman to suffocate to death inside of a bag, a man who betrayed the trust of a parishioner, a man who knew that his collar not only protected him, but gave him privileges that would not be afforded to regular citizens. In the end, it was about being held accountable for what he did. Earthly justice matters. Consequences should be forced. John Fite's wife never made a public statement about the ordeal of her husband's conviction, and none of his family attended the trial. Fite only served a little over 2 years of his sentence and died in 2020. He was 87 years old, 62 years longer than Irene lived.
Yeah, he lived his whole life free.
An institution can't be blamed for an individual's behavior. Rapists, murderers, child molesters, and thieves can be found hiding in any organization, from sports teams to scouts to political offices to schools to religions. I mean, all religions, not just a Catholic one. It's the cover-up, the complacency, and the total disregard for the victims that the institution can be blamed for. Irene Garza was a better Catholic than the priest who murdered her, a better human than the law enforcement who looked the other way, and the institution that protected her killer. In a letter Irene wrote to a friend just days before her death, she stated, quote, "I am much happier than I've ever been." And in a hateful, heinous, selfish act, the future lay before her. The state of happiness that she had discovered was taken away. And that's it. That's all I've got.
And it is right. There are terrible people, especially everywhere. They like to hide in schools. I mean, how many times do we see in the news every day that a school personnel or bus driver or custodian or whatever has
if they
harmed
like
a
kids,
child?
They're going to go try to be where the kids are.
But the thing is, what does make it bad is looking the other way.
Right.
Is putting the person in a closet in a different state thinking, no.
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
I mean, those people that condone that are just as guilty as the one that committed the murder.
I agree.
To me.
100% agree. And that it was so callously, well, we're going to do this and you know why we're doing this and it can't be said. The media cannot do this because they'll make us look bad. And that's the whole thing. They didn't want to look bad. But they look bad now.
Yeah, I was going to say,
they look worse now.
An organization cannot be responsible for one individual's action. So if they would all of this, from the sexual assault, children, all of it, come out and just own it, you know?
We have this person, and he's a horrible person, and
here
he
you
needs
go.
to be punished. Exactly. Yep. Instead of saying, oh, we don't want to look bad. Honestly, I was shocked to learn that about the Alexian brothers. I didn't know that they would send priests there because of stress. But I didn't know that it was for other reasons, too. I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I believe it.
And I guess from doing that and the exorcism that was held there, that's why it burned down.
That's true.
And there's not many Alexian Brothers churches out there. I think there's only 5, 6, maybe 7 in the world. Yeah.
Wow. I'll never forget watching a documentary. I know. And it was based on the Catholic scandal with the sex abuse and this little boy. And I regret, if I had known that this was the case, I would have looked this up before. But he basically had a quote that, like, you know, growing up devoutly Catholic with his family, there's God, and right under God is the father, the priest, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, so when the priest is abusing you, it is like you are basically being abused by God. And it goes against everything you've ever thought. And he was very well spoken. It broke my heart. It made me cry, to tell you the truth. Come to find out, a couple of years later, he completed suicide. He could not handle it. And he was like in his late 30s, early 40s. Really good looking guy, really well spoken, educated, grew up in the Catholic school system, all that stuff. And it was just like him describing how his parents would hand him over to the priest to stay the night. Because, of course, in their home, being devout Catholics, you know, that you would have the priest over for Sunday dinner, you know, alternating houses and things like that. I don't know. It was, a lot. And that's heartbreaking. And for a little boy, and just to have
anyone.
But I mean, a child, I guess, for a child to go through this and having that double, this person walks on water in your world, but then they're doing this to you, and have him explaining all that. It was something. So
a mess. I mean,
as our listeners may or may not know, in St. Louis, we are a huge Catholic city. Back in the 80s, the Pope came to St. Louis, which is, you know, so we are very.
It was the early 90s. Pope John Paul II, I believe it was. Yeah. Yeah, it was awful. I mean, it wasn't awful, but some of the merch that they had here was awful. I mean, they did one T-shirt where he looked like a prune. I mean, it was just bad merch. But
hey, let me tell you.
It was a huge deal. Like, you couldn't get through an evening's television program without
it was huge.
6 or 7 interruptions of the whole. I mean, they told you how they built his throne. They told you, like, the material that was, I mean, it was...
The Pope Mobile? Remember the Pope Mobile?
Do you remember the Pope Mobile? And Irene was gorgeous. Like, you look at the pictures back then, and she's got these the crinoline dresses with the huge skirt. I mean, she was a beauty queen. There's no saying she wasn't. Such a shame. Somebody she trusted. Somebody
that's what I mean.
She was so devout.
Ooh, angry me. Good job, Jen. And when you first started this, I thought this was a different case. And I know true crime people out there will know this case about I guess it was a lady in a barrel. And that's where I thought this was, because I kind of got confused. But she was found in a barrel, and it was, 40, 60 years later. And it turns out she was this beautiful, I think she was Hispanic. I want to say Texas, and young. And she started having an affair with her boss, and she found herself with child, Jen. And the guy, her boss, the one that she loved, killed her and put her in that barrel. And and he kept that barrel like underneath his crawl space of his house for like 60 years. And they finally got him. But I thought that was the story, because she was so beautiful and so young and all that. So
Well, what I found interesting about this case is right after Irene was found, like, people immediately said it was a priest. Like, immediately. People felt guilty. They whispered it, you know, like, it's got to be a priest. It's, you know what I mean? And they knew.
Knowing how often she spent time there, and then in the middle of confession, he disappears. And then the cold callousness in which he comes back and then does confession again.
Then baptizes people the next day, holds the Easter Mass.
To me, that is the sign of evil. Like, you, sociopath, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, not to speculate or anything, but you have to wonder if he did hurt other people. And that they're
I don't think you do that
up.
Twice in your lifetime and then just stop doing it.
Well, the first one was just he tried and nothing happened.
Mm-hmm. But I'm saying,
you know what I mean? And then the next time
attack.
he murder somebody.
Yeah, I call.
Callously murder, like, oh, you'll be better. Like when she was dead saying, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Yeah. And then you do it once and then you're fine. I guess it could happen. But
not that, because he was sort of a sexual predator. That was number 2. That doesn't just go away.
He liked Hispanic women. The woman he married was Hispanic. That was his type. So,
and he was a sexual predator.
Yeah.
Regardless. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you did a good job, Jen.
Yeah,
That's
he needs to.
Just fires me up
now.
Well, Jen, that was a good case. I guess I'm going to look forward to seeing you next week at the same time, same place. So until then, remember, lock your doors.
Keep passing by those open windows.
Bye-bye.
Love ya. For more information about this episode, as well as all other sources, please check out our show notes or the podcast website at ourtruecrimepodcast.com. Our True Crime Podcast is developed and created by the hosts, Jen and Cam. Original music and audio mix of all our True Crime Podcast episodes is courtesy of Nico Vertesi from We Talk of Dreams. You can reach Nico at wetalkofdreams.com. Listener discretion is provided by Edward October from OctoberPod VHS. You can find all of his great works on YouTube. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our True Crime Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We can be reached on Instagram and Facebook at Our True Crime Podcast or on Twitter with the handle at Our True Crime Pod. You can also email us at ourtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. We would also at this time like to thank our patrons. We would be so lost without you. Thank you so much. And if you would like to help support the show, you can check us out on patreon.com/Our True Crime Podcast. You can also show your support by leaving a 5-star review on Apple or simply just tell your friends about us. It's that easy. Love ya. They took in priests and promised anonymity. I can't say this word. And promised anonymity.
Nope.
Anonymity. And promised anonymity. And promised anonymity.
Nope.
Fuck.
This is like Nemo.
I know.
The anonymity.
You say it.
Anonymity. You're putting an extra M on the end there.
I am.
Hey, man. Trust me. I know. I mean, I get it.
Sorry, Nico.
Anonymity. Anonymity. There you go.
And promised anonymity.
Nope.
And promised anonymity.
Nope.
Nope. Fuck. And it's a quote, too, so I had to say it.
I know, you do.
And promised anonymity. And then... Sorry, Nico.
Just at the very end, you're like putting the B
anonymity. Anonymity. And promised anonymity.
There.
Fuck. They took in priests and promised anonymity. Is that good enough?
One more time.
And promised anonymity.
Anonymity.
And promised anonymity.